as part of the Islamic holy period of Ramadan, which began earlier this month. It's also traditionally a time when families and friends have come together to celebrate. And in many parts of the world, this will be the first opportunity to gather in this way since the start of the pandemic more than 2 years ago. But with the cost of living crisis and fallout from sanctions on Russia causing food prices to surge, what's it like to celebrate Ramadan in 2022? We're joined now by Sahirah Javaid, Senior Press Officer at the UK-based charity Muslim Hands. Good morning to you.
Morning.
There will be a real desire for people to gather to break the fast at sunset this year, but it will be tougher for some families.
Yes, definitely. As you mentioned, that Ramadan is an important month in the Islamic calendar. It's about giving, it's about prayer, reflection and community. And it's the first time since the pandemic that families will be getting together, that mosques will be open for communal worship. And there's a sense of community spirit in our local communities, which is being felt more than ever before because of the impact of the pandemic, but also because of the rising costs of living and the record rates of inflation that are impacting the Muslim community. A recent report outlined that 50% of Muslim families are struggling to put enough food on the table to break their fast, which is 1.6 million Muslims who are living in poverty and deprivation. Muslim households are often big and they're multi-generational, and they often work in low-income jobs, which means that these families will really struggle to put food on the table as they have more mouths to feed. And many of these families are choosing between heating their home or putting food on the table or feeding themselves or their children. And to be able to cope with this, we've seen a huge increase in the use of food banks and open kitchens in both Nottingham and Hounslow. And we've been giving more Ramadan meals and essentials for our service users to be able to feed their families during this time. And I think what's also really important to mention is that Ramadan has also coincided with the Easter holidays. And many of these families would have relied on breakfast clubs and lunch meals offered by schools to help them cope with these overwhelming demands and responsibilities.
So what's happening to those children, the Muslim children who would have got free school meals, who are at home in the holidays without them?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very eye-opening and encouraging, although a very sad situation that Muslims and other faith groups have been able to be in the food bank and open kitchen space. You know, we've been able to open doors to much needed conversations around food poverty. You know, there's a kind of sense of shame and taboo to kind of talk about that. And it's really important that reports and studies like this are vital because they're able to create, change and introduce and signpost appropriate and relevant support groups and organisations. So many of these families whose children are on the Easter holidays, they will be going to open kitchens or food banks to receive the support that they desperately need.
And you talk about a sense of shame and taboo. There's also a sense of great hospitality, particularly when it comes to breaking the fast. So people want to be able to, feed their extended families as well. Is there a sense of shame at not being able to sort of put on a spread that you might have been able to 3 years ago?
Definitely, Muslims, we typically give more in Ramadan, and so there's this sense of giving, especially during the month, this Islamic month. But, as a charity during the pandemic, we saw a huge increase where people were at home and they were able to save. And this year, we've seen a stark contrast where though people are giving, we've actually seen a drop in our donations where they've been much smaller. So definitely the high cost of living is having an impact.
And what about Muslims in other countries? I mean, we've heard the shortage of grain, for example, in Egypt is affecting, the price of things, of foods that are usually served to break fast in Ramadan. What are you hearing about Muslims in other countries?
Yeah, so in January, I was able to actually visit Yemen and I was confronted by the immense scale of hunger. I saw firsthand how 7 years of conflict and aid cuts have shattered lives. Mothers were begging on the streets, babies severely malnourished. My colleagues have seen people rummaging through rubbish bins, to try to feed their families. And as you mentioned, with Ukraine, being the largest importer of wheat, Yemen relies 50% of its wheat import from Russia and Ukraine. And according to the World Food Programme, over 50% of Yemen's population is food insecure. So the Ukraine conflict will have consequences for Yemen as the country heavily relies on its wheat imports. And the world and Yemen, will be competing for this limited resource, with rising prices on wheat and other basic food items, will mean that Yemen families will either continue to ration their meals or go hungry.
And as well as affecting the price of food, the conflict, the crisis in Ukraine has meant that the world's attention has moved away from Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Syrian refugees, doesn't it?
Yes, no, definitely. I think we can't ignore global poverty is at its highest according to the United Nations, and that's attributed to climate change, conflict, the aid cuts. In terms of Ukraine, in comparison to other conflicts, is very recent and therefore it's very fresh in people's minds, and it's close to home, being in Europe. And so people are able to connect to it. And it really much shows that conflicts can happen in our very own doorstep. And also it's impacting the way that we're living in terms of the cost of living, the rising price of fuel, and, whether families can afford to put their heating on. But I also do believe that it has provided a platform for other crises to be spoken about. More people are speaking about Yemen and Afghanistan because of the wheat crisis. It goes hand in hand. You simply cannot talk about Ukraine and not talk about the impact that it will be having in Yemen and Afghanistan.
Sahirah Javaid from the charity Muslim Hands, thank you so much for your time this morning.